When you think of an empire, what comes to mind? Armies, conquests, maps, countries painted in imperial colors. But in the 20th century, a different kind of empire rose. It didn't need soldiers, only signatures. There were no armies marching into cities. Instead, there were men in suits flying into capitals, carrying loan agreements in their briefcases. And this shadow empire became most visible in Latin America. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, wasn't just lending money. It was rewriting entire economies, dictating national policies, and shaping the fate of hundreds of millions of people. All in the name of stability. All in the service of creditors. The paradox is clear. The IMF was founded in 1944 at Bretton Woods. Its mission was to stabilize exchange rates, prevent economic collapse, and help nations recover from the ruins of war. It sounded like the doctor of the financial world. Here to heal, to stabilize, to give struggling countries room to breathe. But in Latin America, that doctor quickly became something else. A debt collector. It did whatever was necessary to recover the money of banks in New York and London. The patient didn't matter. Step into Latin America in the 1970s. Countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina were racing to modernize. They built industries, expanded state companies, and subsidized food and fuel to preserve social stability. Politicians promised growth today, and paid for it with tomorrow's credit. And tomorrow's bill would be massive. In the 1970s, cheap money flooded the world. Oil prices rose. Dollars piled up in Western banks. And banks were eager to lend. Latin American leaders saw an opportunity. Borrow in dollars. Spend on infrastructure. Finance social programs. Keep the political machine running. Highways, dams, factories, railways, all built with foreign money. It looked like a miracle. High growth, popular politicians. But there was always a trap. In the early 1980s, the crisis arrived. The U.S. Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, raised interest rates sharply to crush inflation. Overnight, Latin America's cheap loans turned into crushing debt. Loans that once carried 5% interest suddenly demanded 15 to 20%. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina. They could no longer pay. In 1982, Mexico's finance minister went to Washington and admitted, "We cannot service our debt." It was financial bankruptcy. And the IMF was there. The IMF's prescription was harsh. Governments were forced to cut food and fuel subsidies, devalue their currencies, making imports more expensive, freeze wages, privatize state companies, slash budgets for health, education, and pensions. And for whose benefit? For the banks that had lent the money. Politicians used the IMF as a shield. They could tell their people, "We have no choice. The IMF demands it." The result? Bread became more expensive. Public workers lost jobs. Schools lost funding. But foreign creditors were protected. Latin America became a laboratory for austerity. And the people were the test subjects. The lost decade. Between 1980 and 1990, GDP per capita in Latin America fell. Countries grew poorer, yet continued to send billions abroad in debt payments. Economists called it the lost decade. Poverty rose. Inequality deepened. Social services collapsed. When fuel subsidies were cut in Caracas, riots erupted. When wages were frozen in Buenos Aires, protests exploded. The IMF portrayed itself as neutral, technocratic, rational. But the reality was obvious. It was not neutral. It existed to ensure debts were repaid, to protect the system, and to move money upward. Mexico, the first domino. In 1982, Mexico collapsed. Wall Street trembled. Mexico wasn't alone. Many Latin American countries had borrowed under the same logic. The IMF stepped in, not just as a savior, but as the force stabilizing the global banking system. The conditions were simple. You can receive new loans, but you must cut spending, privatize state assets, and liberalize your economy. And so the Washington Consensus was born. Trade liberalization, fiscal austerity, deregulation, privatization of state enterprises. In theory, economies would become competitive and efficient. In practice, social safety nets collapsed, and wealth flowed not to the people, but often to foreign investors. Bolivia, the social cost. In 1985, Bolivia suffered one of the worst hyperinflations in its history. The IMF prescribed shock therapy. Subsidies were cut. The currency was devalued. Government spending was slashed. Inflation fell, but the cost was brutal. Unemployment surged. Mines closed. Communities were abandoned. The IMF recorded it as a success. Bolivians remembered it as a social catastrophe. Argentina, when the medicine becomes poison. In the 1990s, Argentina followed the IMF's prescriptions. Pegged its currency to the dollar. Privatized state companies. Cut deficits. At first, it looked like success. Foreign investors arrived. Politicians celebrated. But debt piled up. Exports lost competitiveness. Social tensions grew. In 2001, the system collapsed. Banks froze accounts. People lost their savings. The streets of Buenos Aires erupted. The IMF, once applauded as a savior, lost all credibility. Understanding Latin America. The IMF followed the same pattern again and again. Creditors were protected. People suffered. Politicians blamed the IMF. The public saw wage cuts and lost subsidies. Leaders said, the IMF demanded it. The 1980s remain Latin America's lost decade. Incomes fell. Poverty rose. Education and health investment collapsed, yet billions continued to flow outward as debt payments. The global lesson. The IMF presents itself as neutral, but its decisions are political and favor creditors. Sovereignty is weakened not by occupation, but by spreadsheets. National budgets are dictated by officials who don't live in those countries. And this isn't limited to Latin America. Asia in 1997. Russia in the 1990s. Greece after 2008. Debt is not just a number. It is a tool of control. And developed countries are not immune. If interest rates stay high. If growth stalls. If investors demand repayment. IMF-style austerity can be imposed anywhere. Final thought. Latin America's lost decade should not be forgotten. It revealed the mechanics of the system. Money and power protect the few, not the many. But if you learn the lesson, history doesn't have to crush you. You can rethink how you see debt, savings, and wealth. Real wealth is not what the system promises you. Assets with real value. Skills that cannot be devalued. Networks no one can privatize. History does not repeat, but it rhymes brutally. The IMF's shadow over Latin America was never just about debt. It revealed how power is exercised over people. And if we don't learn this, the same game will be played again. Not in Mexico, but in Europe, Tokyo, Washington. When politicians talk about hard choices, remember who pays the bill. The people. Debt is never just debt. It is leverage. And with every lever, there is a hand pulling the strings. History doesn't repeat itself. But if you don't understand it, it will crush you in the same way. If this perspective opened a new window for you, subscribe. History holds the answers. I'll show you where to look.